right, well, we want to start by thanking everyone for attending this morning, and we want to welcome you to the fourth in our series of our water loss control webinars. The project wouldn't be possible without the vision and funding from the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. So the training series that we're giving and the individual technical assistance that we can provide, it's available to all of the utilities that are participating in this program for free. And all of that wouldn't be possible without TDEC support. So we know that water loss control is important, is an important issue nationally, and we know that to Tennessee in particular, it's important. It's also near and dear to us. So again, we just wanted to thank TDEC for sponsoring this project. And then a little bit about us, for those of you who haven't attended the training sessions before, for those of you that have, the next few slides will be familiar to you, but for those of you that have not, we just want to let you know a little bit about us. The group that I'm with today that's providing the training and provides the technical assistance is the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. We are a multidisciplinary team. We have folks in engineering, folks that do water resources, teaching, computer programming, GIS mapping, accounting, a wide variety of backgrounds. We are based out of the University of New Mexico, which is located in Albuquerque, New Mexico. But today, the three of us are actually in 3 different locations, 3 different time zones. So James gets the worst of it because he's in the on the West Coast. So it is super early for James. So kudos to James for being here, getting up early for us East Coast folks. And then Heather is in Albuquerque and holding down the fort at the University of New Mexico, although none of us have been on campus for a while. And then I am a remote employee, permanently remote employee based out of Knoxville. So here in the region with you guys today. So you can see our mission statement in the middle of the screen there. And it really is what we're about. We really want to develop capacity and we want systems to be self-reliant. We have we believe that teaching a man to fish approach is much more successful than fishing for them and having to be expected to come back and continue to do that work. We want you to be self-reliant. The Southwest EFC currently has a team of 11 people. That's not right anymore, is it? So we're at 13 people now. We're growing, and you're gonna, of course, meet 3 of us today. So we'll do introductions here in just a second. And the Southwest EFC does focus on helping systems to answer questions in that technical, financial, and managerial realm for water and wastewater. And we provide training on a wide variety of topics. But in particular, this team, the 3 of us, have most recently focused on training in asset management and water loss control. And we really do feel like those 2 go hand in hand. And we will kind of pull that through the session today. The 3 of us that are training you today will do introductions and then we'll get into the meat of the training. So a little bit about me. I have worked in water since I was interning in college. I worked in a wastewater treatment plant in my college internship and realized that I was majoring in chemical engineering, thought I'd do plastics, went to work at a plastics plant in my hometown, and they put me in the wastewater plant. And I thought that was the craziest thing ever. And I ended up falling in love with water treatment, wastewater treatment, and I've been doing it ever since. So in my career, water is life, and then also in my personal life. So that's me and my family in our boat on the Tennessee River here in Knoxville. That's my kiddos and my nephew and my daughter playing on the beach when we vacation. And then because there wasn't enough water recently, we added a pool. So we really do focus, I really do focus on water. So the pool is open. The boat has not been on the water yet, but I'm hoping to fix that here real soon. So, James, I'll pass it off to you and you can introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm James Markham. I've been with the EFC for, I guess, about 5 years right now. I've got kind of a diverse background, operations management and law before engineering. But I spend most of my time thinking about water loss control and pipe break and GIS data these days. When I'm not thinking about water or traveling around or sitting behind a computer doing training like this, I'm usually thinking about music, and in specific, I'm thinking about building guitars. That's one of my creations there that you're looking at. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I build them better than I play them. So you will not be hearing from me today, at least not from the guitar perspective, but you will definitely be hearing from me about water loss auditors, which is another favorite thing of mine. So thanks for joining us.
All right, thanks, James. And Heather?
Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Himmelberger, and I'm the director of the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. And although I'm an engineer by training, I'm really in operations management and finance by choice. I really love being out and about with water and wastewater operators. I've been all over the country to all 50 states and the territories and worked in water and wastewater all over the place. And I just love digging in and hearing what people are going through and how we can help. So really look forward to today and working with all of you, and I'm glad to be here.
All right, thanks guys. And just as a reminder, feel free to use that chat feature and type in any communications with us that you have, and we will do our best to answer any questions you have as we go. So with those introductions, let's get started with today's training. What we want to start with today is seeing how the last training applied activity went for you. So if you recall, at the end of the last training session, we provided you with the opportunity to try out a couple of the activities we discussed during the training, and we just want to see how it went. So we're going to go through just a quick series of poll questions to see how it went for you. And the polls will pop up on your screen as we go through them. You just pick the appropriate answer, and that's all that you have to do. And the answers are anonymous, so we're not going to come back and say, oh, so-and-so said that they did this or they didn't do that. This is just a way for us to get a feel for how it's going for you and to see if there are areas that we need to kind of circle back on, or how things are progressing. So if you recall the activity that we gave you, we wanted you to try to prioritize your goals at your system. So we had the importance urgency matrix. We asked you to put your goals on the Post-it notes and then take the time to prioritize them like we did in the activity. So what we want to know is if you were able to do that. So James, if you can run that first poll question for me. Were you able to prioritize your goals? And we have a set of answers there. Find the one that best suits you. If you're not a water system, you can feel free to use the not applicable option, so we kind of know when to wrap up the poll when everyone's had a chance to answer. And then for everyone else, there's a set of answers there. We already have them. We did prioritize them. We have plans. We haven't started yet, or we don't have plans. So if you can kind of pick one of those and let us know how it went for you. And if you weren't able to attend the last training or any of the trainings in the series, they are recorded and they are on our website, so you can catch up with any of the trainings that have already occurred. All right, so the results are that one of you already had answers or already had your goals prioritized, and that's fantastic to hear. 2 of you have plans to meet, 3 of you haven't started yet, and for 2 of you it did not apply. So for those of you that haven't started yet, again, we do have that free technical assistance available, and we'd be happy to work with you if you need any kind of assistance with setting goals or writing goals or prioritizing those goals, or just kind of putting the team together and figuring out how to get them to meet. I know that different things take priorities, but if this is something that interests you, let us know and we'd be happy to help. All right, James, I think you can launch the second one. So with this one, we want to know if you did prioritize your goals, how many of them were in that highest priority category? So up here in the high urgency, high importance, medium urgency, medium importance boxes. So how many of you had, or how many goals ended up in those high priority boxes? All right, so we've got kind of an even spread of 1 or 2 and 3 and 4, and that's good. The reason that we asked you this question is because when we met and we practiced this, we said sometimes you do have more than one goal in a box. And not always are you going to have exactly 9 goals. So they may not, distribute evenly. But we don't want you to end up with all of your goals up here or all of your goals down here. So we do want you to use the tool to be able to put some spread in those goals, because you probably aren't going to be able to do all of them at once. And having a way to identify which ones you should target first is a useful tool to be able to have that discussion at your utility and then figure out where to start investing your time and effort. So that's a good results there for those of you that have prioritized your goals, to have just a few in that high priority area. So the second activity that we gave you was for you to try to assess your current data practices. So as you recall, we were talking about data quality and the type of data that you have. Is it paper? Is it electronic? Is it accessible? Is it usable? So what we asked you to do was to take a look at your current data for the different types of data categories that exist in the water audit, and think about how you access that information now, and if there are things that you'd like to change in the future. So what we want to find out is if you've started that process or not. So James, if you can run the next poll question. So have you started this data evaluation process? Yes, no, we have plans to, or no, we don't have plans to, or not applicable. All right, well, that's good answers there. We have 1 that did and 3 that are planning to, 0 that don't have plans to, so that's good news. So that's what I like to see. And again, we just want to remind you that if you have, plans to, and you've got questions, or you think, we would like to get this in a different format, but we don't even know what format that might be, you can reach out to us. We can talk to you about the different ways we've seen folks collect data, the tools that they've used, and we're happy to work with you in that way. So speaking of assistance, that's our last poll question. And for obvious reasons, this is the only one that's not anonymous. So James, if you can run the poll, if you would like assistance on any of these activities, then if you say yes, we will get in touch with you and see what assistance we can provide you on any of these activities. Just a quick yes or no. And I think I'm already working with a couple of the systems that are on today, so that's good news. And we'd love to work with more of you if you have any interest.
And even if you don't know what you need help with today, go ahead and have a conversation with us, because there may be things that you're not even thinking of. So just have a general conversation with us about, what's going on with your system, and we can see if there's anything that we can help you with, even if you're not sure.
Good point. All right, James, I think you can wrap that one up. And then just a reminder that if you missed any of the training sessions, the recordings are on our website. So now we're going to go ahead and dig into the content for today's training on your audit, your data validity, and your data accuracy. So that's where we're going to get started here. So Tennessee has water loss audit requirements for water systems that are really unique. They're unique to the country. And so we're going to spend just a few minutes this morning identifying what those requirements are, and then talking about why they exist. So the information that I am covering today that I'm sharing with you can be found on the Tennessee Comptroller of the Treasury's webpage. So that link is shown here at the bottom of your screen. And I also wanted to point out that they've just very recently added the note that's shown here about the audit versions to their website. So if you've heard about AWWA releasing the new water audit software version 6, that happened at the beginning of this year. And so the state has decided not to move to version 6, but to stay with version 5. So it should be what you're familiar with and what we will be training on today as well. So version 5 is what the state has decided to stick with for the time being. And then Decision by the state is that water systems must include the water loss audit when they submit their financial statements to the Comptroller of the Treasury. And this has been a requirement for over 10 years now. So all of the water systems that are here should be familiar with it to some level. You have been submitting water audits to the Comptroller's office for some time now. And these requirements are what's written. The audit spreadsheet must be submitted at the same time as the annual audited financial statements. And if the water loss is not included with financial statements, the water loss system will be referred to one of the boards, the Water and Wastewater Financing Board or the Utility Management Review Board. They have a few other requirements. The outcomes of the audit must not fall below these requirements. So the ones that are shown here, validity score of 80 or less, and then the non-revenue water as a percent by cost of operating system of 20% or greater. If the system does fall below those requirements, they will be referred to the board. Again, either the Water and Wastewater Financing Board or the Utility Management Board. So who are these boards? How are they different? Well, the boards serve two different types of systems. The Utility Management Review Board serves public utility districts. The Water and Wastewater Financing Board serves municipalities, counties, and treatment authorities. So if you're a public utility district, you'd be under Utility Management Review Board. Otherwise, you're going to be under the Water and Wastewater Financing Board. So what happens if you're referred to the board? Well, you would go through this formal review process. So if you're referred to either board, you go through the same process. And the rules from the boards describe that process, and it's the same for both boards. So I've summarized it here on the screen, and I do want to go through how it's written in the rules with you, just because I think we have this idea that a referral is maybe really bad news or causes a lot of extra work. So I just kind of want to run through it with you to clarify that, in case you're not terribly familiar with what happens in a formal review. So when an entity is referred by operation of statute to the board for any reason, including but not limited to financial distress, comptroller investigation, or what we're here for today, excessive water loss, the entity will undergo a formal review by staff and the board. So the boards have staff that would be participating in the review process. So in preparation for the board's formal review, the staff may request and review documents of the entity and speak with officials and staff of the entity. So the staff from the boards would come to you and say, we need you to show us your policy, or we need you to explain to us how you completed the water loss audit or why you didn't complete the water loss audit. And the staff are going to gather verifiable information and then summarize that information and provide it to the board. And the staff have to be able to provide backup documentation of any statements that are made in any case summary. Once that process is done, the board will review the staff's case summary at a public meeting. They'll request the backup documentation and they'll decide what the entity has to do to remedy the issue. And so the board will then direct the council to document the requirements, and that would either be in the form of a board order, a letter, or a memorandum. And the requirements have to be met by the system before the board releases them from oversight and the formal review. The order or the letter or the memorandum would require the entity to update the board in writing by a certain date of what they've done so that they can be released from the board oversight. And then at the appropriate time, the board would direct the council to close the case and inform the entity of the change status. So really, this review process is about understanding why you were unable to meet the requirements and how you're going to resolve that. So it's really about getting you to meet the requirements, not about you being in trouble, or sometimes it feels like you're even on the naughty list, you know, and that's really not the purpose. The purpose is to figure out what's going on and how to fix it. So the real purpose of the comptroller's office and having these requirements is the comptroller's office really wants to ensure financial sustainability for the systems. And the customers pay rates that should be based on that sustainability. But if your system has excessively high water loss and you're saying that you need to raise rates, you're not being held accountable. So by submitting your water loss audit with your financial statements, you're showing that you are accountable, that you don't have excessive high water loss, and that you still need to raise rates. It's not because you're just pumping water down the street and you want to charge your customers for that. So that's the reason, is to make sure that the water that we're pumping and selling is the water that we're pumping is actually being sold, is actually going to the customers, and there isn't a need to address water loss before we raise rates. And then by requiring that data validity score to increase, over the last 8 years, the requirements have increased every year. And then for the last couple of years, they've remained at this higher level. So by requiring that increase to the data validity score and to the high level, or to the non-revenue water to decrease over the last 8 years, you're really showing you're improving over time, which again communicates that accountability. So that's the whole reason for submitting your water loss audit at the same time as you submit your financial information. However, the comptroller's office and the board aren't really telling you how to get there, how to decrease your non-revenue water, how to increase your data validity score. They're not telling you how to reduce that water loss. If you are referred to the board, they may provide some guidance if you fail to meet the requirements, but that's where TDEC is coming in now. They really want you to fully understand your water loss and how to better control it, not to just, you know, kind of meet a requirement, but understand the how to. And that's why this program exists, because TDEC really saw the need for water loss control to be explained, the incorporation of water loss control to be explained. The need for water loss control is clear. We understand that we don't want to leak water, lose water, but the how-to is now being incorporated. So that's the reason for this series, and that's the vision that TDEC has, is to get us to that how-to. So I'm going to turn things over at this point to James, and he's going to walk through that data validity process. So those data grades and that you put into the audit, that you have to have that certain score. He's going to walk through what those grades are, how they're weighted, all kinds of important stuff for you guys to really understand data validity and data grades. So James, excuse me, got a frog right there at the end. James, take it away.
Now that we've sort of talked about data grading and the validity scores from sort of that regulatory perspective and accountability perspective, I want to dive into the data grading and the data validity score components in the audit and look at them both from a functional aspect, in other words, you know, where they are in the audit, how the grading works, and what the grading and data validity score is supposed to represent. And then also from an operational and water loss reduction standpoint, by which I mean, you know, how do we realistically assess the data grades in relation to actual policies, practices, and procedures, how we can use that information that we learn through going through the data grading process to both increase future data validity scores and help drive water loss control programs and reduce non-revenue water in the utility in general. And then also, you know, just to make sure that you have a solid understanding of how your grades are derived and where they came from in the case that you do end up talking to one of the boards, so that when you're having that talk with the board staff, that you can explain, you know, where your system is and why it's there. So I'm going to do a little bit of review here. Just as a refresher, for those of you who maybe aren't directly involved with developing water audits in your system, or if you haven't looked at it for a while, because it is an annual process. So sometimes the details get a little hazy in between audits. But the audit has sort of three big outcomes that we kind of refer to as the 3 V's. The first is the volume of water that's in each category. Some of those categories are going to be based on information that's entered by you, some of which are going to be calculated by the audit based on the inputs that you put in. The second V is the value. So the value of the non-revenue water in each category, which is going to be based on the economics of your particular system, including your cost of operations, what you charge your customer for volumetric rates, and variable production costs for water in your system. And I do want to note that these are really the only costing methods provided in the audit, even though social and environmental costs associated with water loss are very real. They are harder to quantify, and so they're not directly addressed in the water audit software. It's really more sort of a dollars and cents kind of approach. And then finally, the last piece, which is what we're going to be talking about today, which is the validity of the audit, which is based on individual data grades assigned to each data point in the audit and then represented by an overall data validity score. And that's really what we're covering today. So the first thing to point out is that, even though the data validity mechanism uses numbers, it's essentially a qualitative procedure and not a quantitative one. And by that, I mean that it's essentially an assessment of system policies, practices, and procedures related to the data points in question that serve as a proxy for a statistical accuracy assessment. Even though there are some numerical criteria considered, like percentage of sources that are metered when you're grading the volume from one source's data point, the data grading process is not about determining the statistical probability that any number that you've entered in any of the fields is exact or correct within plus or minus X%. And neither is the resultant overall data validity score. So it's not there to determine a statistical margin of error, although there are tools that can be used to do that. And we'll go over those later in the training series. And it's really important to understand that, a data validity score of 80 doesn't mean that you have an 80% confidence in the audit results. Those don't line up that way. There are some European water audit software packages that do include that kind of statistical analysis, but the AWWA made a conscious choice to use this qualitative assessment process to make it easier for systems to complete an audit and assess their inputs. So qualitative, not quantitative. It's also not a test score like you think of, from a school where 98 is an A plus and 90 is an A and 80 is a B. That's not how the grading system works. It's essentially just an assessment of your practices based against a set of criteria that a group of experts essentially put together. And so although it may look like a grade you might have gotten in high school or college, that's not what it is. And finally, the data validity score is not a value judgment. The basic idea is that the more rigorous your practices, policies, and procedures are, the more likely it is that they're going to produce accurate data. And the audit tries to assess that in a relatively uncomplicated manner using, as I said, criteria put together by a panel of experts. So it's, again, a proxy for that statistical accuracy assessment. So now that we know what the grades are and aren't in a general sense, let's dig a little bit deeper. There's an easy part to data grading and a part that requires more thought. So we'll start with the easy bit, and that's where the grades are entered in the audit. And again, this may be some review for those of you who've actually compiled an audit, but if you haven't, or if you're sort of relatively new to this process, I think it's worthwhile to sort of go over the mechanics as well as the interpretation part. So there are multiple sheets in the water audit software. It's essentially a very fancy Excel spreadsheet, and the data grades are entered on the reporting sheet, the same place that you put the various volumes that you put in. So they show up just to the left of the parameter that they're associated with. I will note that there are a couple that show up on the right side of the page. These tend to deal with the meter adjustments for the various source inputs. There's a data grade associated with each point, even the data points that the audit can calculate for you, which I'll address in a second. There are 20 possible data grades in total, and they're all either graded not applicable If you don't have a particular input for that specific parameter, so in my example here, you'll see the second one, water imported, the volume is 0. If there's no volume, you don't have to assign a grade for that. You can either skip it or just put in an A. And if you do have an input, it's graded on a 1 to 10 scale. And while 20 data grades might seem a lot, most systems aren't typically going to use all of them. Like our example here, there are also a few data grades that potentially will be graded automatically if you choose to use the default values that the audit provides. Now, Heather's going to be digging into this question of whether or not to use those defaults later in our program today. But for now, for example, if you look at the default value for unauthorized consumption, the nice way of saying theft, you can see that there is a default percentage of 0.25% of billed authorized consumption. And if you use it default, it automatically assigns a grade of 5 for you. Systematic data handling errors and unbilled, unmetered consumption work the same way, with a data grade of 5 assigned for the default percentage if you use it. If you decide to manually tally up volumes for those data points instead of using the default, you actually have to go through and grade it. So be aware of that difference. There's also a grade for average length of customer service line. If you're a system that happens to locate its meters on the property line, there's a yes or no question related to that. And if you answer yes, you get a grade of 10 automatically assigned. So quick review, 20 individual grades, 1 for each data input, scores of 1 to 10 unless it's not applicable. They're mostly on the left, but a few are on the right. And do note that for unauthorized consumption, customer metering inaccuracies, and systematic data handling errors, the input is on the right side of the page, but the data grading is on the left. It's a little bit of a format issue. So now we know where to put the grades. We get to the more cerebral part, or the thinking part, and that's what grades are we going to actually enter in any of these given fields. And this does require some attention to detail, and in some cases, a little bit of interpretation. First thing to remind you or point out here is that data grades are not uniform. I really want to emphasize this. Just because you get a grade of 10 on the first data point does not mean you can carry that all the way through the entire audit and grade yourself a 10 on everything. Each data point has its own very specific detailed criteria, and each one of them has to be evaluated separately. The only time you don't do the data grade evaluation is if you're using a default or you don't have an input for that particular data point. And even related data grades can sometimes be graded very, very differently. You could have a 10, and I've seen this several times, a 10 for the volume from own sources data point, and only a 2 for the volume from own sources meter error adjustment point. Those are two things that are very, very related, but may end up with very, very different data grades. And while there are some similarities between the language that's used for similar inputs, the grading language does vary from data point to data point, and those criteria vary, and you really have to kind of pay attention. And I'll show you what I mean by this by looking at 2 sets of data grading criteria in the audit that are related to metering. We'll start by looking at source metering, in particular, volume from own sources. And we'll talk about volume from own sources several times over the course of the day today, because it's one of the most important data points from a grading standpoint, as you will see. So the data grade for volume from own sources is based on 4 basic things. There's the percentage of sources that are metered, the frequency of meter accuracy testing and electronic calibration of meters, where you have a SCADA system, the accuracy of test results. If you are indeed testing, there's some arbitrary cutoffs of plus or minus 6% accuracy and plus or minus 3, which when you think about it are actually fairly large percentages for the major input in the audit. And finally, there's a review of procedures by a third party knowledgeable in M36 methodology. And M36 is the AWWA manual that covers water auditing. So essentially what that's talking about is whether a third party who's an expert in water auditing or specialist in water auditing has reviewed the processes related to volume from own sources. Oddly, this doesn't point to somebody who's an M6 methodology expert, somebody who's a meter testing expert. So, as you look at these criteria that I have listed here, it's pretty apparent that they're related to system processes and are going to have an impact on how trustworthy your volume from own sources number is. The more sources are metered, the better that number is likely to be because there's going to be less estimation in the value. Similarly, if you test your meters frequently and they're typically accurate, or you keep the results so that you can do adjustments, you're going to better be able to adjust for whatever inaccuracy is present in your meters. The last one here, this M36 methodology review, kind of begins to hint at the fact that all of the criteria might not be appropriate for your utility. There is definitely some weighting towards automation and things like that in the audit. And also an emphasis on third-party review. And in this case, it's, in order to get a 10 on this particular data point, you have to get review by a third party of your processes and procedures. And while that review might move you from a grade of 9 to 10, and that might be beneficial from sort of an overall data validity score perspective, getting that kind of review might not be a priority for your system. There are a lot of utilities that never get third-party review because they've developed that review expertise internally. So, they're doing the process, but it doesn't quite meet the criteria. Or, the utility might just not be able to afford it, might have other priorities that it wants to spend the money on right now, such as internal training. There's a lot of different reasons why you might not want to do this. But not doing it would restrict your overall data grade to a 9, and that's okay. So we've looked at the criteria for metering on the audit input. Let's go to the other end of the pipe and look at some criteria from the consumption side. And in specific, going to look at billed metered volume, so the volume of water that is being consumed by your metered customers, essentially your paid customer consumption, if you happen to be a system with metered volumetric billing. So the data grade for billed metered volume is based on similar but different criteria than the input side. So here we've got percent of customers with meters, which is similar, but also which customers have volume-based billing. We have meter reading practices considered. So whether it's manual or AMR or AMI or some kind of combination of the three, what your meter records data handling practices are, and also your meter replacement practices. So you can see that these criteria are somewhat similar to those that we talked about for volume from own sources, but they're not the same. And this kind of gets to that whole point of, looking at each criteria individually, looking at each data point individually, because just because you got a 10 on the volume from own sources metering does not mean you're going to get a 10 on the billed metered volume, because the criteria are slightly different. Sure, they both focus on the percentage of connections that are metered, but here we've got more of a focus on billing practices and meter reading practices. And of course, those things are going to impact the trustworthiness of the billed metered volume that you're calculating, typically from your billing records. If you don't have meters on a large portion of your customer base, well, then you're estimating usage for a large portion of them, and your numbers are likely to be less accurate. If you don't read meters regularly, you're more likely to miss slow or stop meters and lose track of volumes that way. But again, you can see that if we look at these criteria, although there are some numerical criteria in there, like the percentage of customers, they don't really directly address the numerical accuracy of the input in any sort of real statistical way. So next point I want to make is that the data grades are not weighted equally in the audit. You probably noticed I said there's 20 possible grades, 1 to 10, but if you've done the audit before, you realize that the data validity score is out of 100, not 200. And that's because the weights of the grades are different. So essentially, some data grades are worth more in the overall data validity score than others. And that weighting doesn't always directly reflect the accuracy of the underlying input that you're grading as well. So you could have, for example, a 7 out of 10 on volume from own sources, which seems like a pretty high grade, but you could still have a 7 and have 20% of your source meters testing outside plus or minus 6% accuracy, which is pretty significant. You know, particularly when you think about the fact that all of those input and output errors flow through the audit and impact non-revenue water in general and real loss in specific, which is what we're using the audit to try and quantify in the first place. So let's look at a couple of data grades and see how the weighting of them would impact the overall data validity score. So for example, from volume from own sources, this is real information from an audit that I was working on a couple of weeks ago. All other things in the audit being equal, this is how the overall data validity score gets impacted by an increase or decrease in the data grade associated with volume from own sources. You know, you can see that there is a 9-point increase from 1 to 10, but the individual steps are worth 3 to 4 points. So you go from a 1 to a 2, you get a 3-point bump in your overall total data validity score. For some reason, when you go from 3 to 4, you get a 4-point bump. And the reason for that is that 9 just doesn't divide into 30 evenly. Now that this is a heavily weighted data grade makes a lot of sense, since typically this is going to be the main value, or at least one of the main values that everything else in the audit is going to be deducted from. You know, errors in this data point are going to have a really big impact on the overall results. So it makes sense to have high data grades and reward having, you know, more exact information here. But again, it's not a statistical assessment. So here's an example, you know, where the data grade itself has a very large impact. Let's look at the other end of the spectrum, because there are some data scores or data grades in the audit that have little to no impact on the overall data validity score, unless you've made a really, really significant jump. And the example I'm going to use here is the companion grade to volume from own sources, and that's the meter error associated with volume from own sources. And here you can see this particular system actually did have a grade of 76 overall, but they could have, and a 6 on this data point, they could drop all the way down to a 1 and it would have no effect. If they, you know, improved their processes enough to jump from a 6 to a 10, they'd still only have a 1-point overall change. So, you know, this is sort of a preview again of one of the topics that Heather's going to be addressing later. But for now, we can just say that, you know, all data grades in the data validity scoring scheme are not created equally. Some are worth a little bit more than others, and that's okay as long as you understand how the grading works, and knowing how they impact the overall data validity score does give you the ability to sort of assess where to put your efforts if you do need to boost your score. So now that we've talked a little bit about what goes into those grades, how do you actually access the criteria that I've been talking about? There are a number of different options that you can use to get to that information. Some is built into the audit, and then we've got a couple of other options as well. If you're just working with the audit, you would hover your mouse over that little red cursor in the corner of the data grading box, and what ends up happening is a little window pops up that looks like this, and it lists all of the data grading criteria. And the basic idea is that you start at the top of the list. You read all the criteria in each line, and so for example, you start with 1 here, assuming you had information to put in that data point, and you read through the entire statement and determine whether you can meet or exceed all of the criteria. If you can, you move on to the next line. So in this case, we've got less than 25% of the sources are metered, the remaining sources are estimated, and that there's no meter testing. So if you had 15% of your sources metered and didn't do any testing, you would meet both of those criteria. If you had 50% of your your sources metered and you did some regular meter testing, you would exceed that and would be able to move on to the next grade. There are what are called in-between grades at 3, 5, 7, and 9. These are sort of conditions between the two sets of criteria above and below them. And the idea here is that you meet or exceed all of the conditions in the prior grade, but only some of the ones for the next higher grade. So if that's the case, then you end up with this in-between grade. So basically when you're going through and doing your evaluation, in this case, you'd start with 1, move on to 2. If you met everything in 2, you would jump to 4, see if you could meet all of those criteria. If you could meet some, but not all of them, you step backwards to that in-between grade, and that ends up being your grade. To be honest, this is one of the bits of completing an audit that is actually kind of hard to use, and again, not because the grading itself is that complicated, but because of the format. The text is really small, the lines are in different colors, there's a lot of detail crammed in here, and if you move your mouse even slightly off that little red triangle, the entire box disappears, and you have to jiggle your mouse around and try to get the window to pop up. So the EFC has come up with a better format of this tool, and that's these data grading PDF sheets that I'm going to show you next. What we've basically done here is recreated that pop-up window in a legible format that just doesn't disappear every time you jiggle your mouse. And we've also split the individual criteria up into sentences that are a bit easier to review. And then an additional benefit of that is each of those items is on a separate row. So it's a little bit easier to parse and evaluate. So it's laid out with the exact same information, but it's just laid out in a little more user-friendly format. You can find these on our website, which is swefc.unm.edu. If you go up there and click on resources, there's a pop-up menu, go down to water loss control under the switchboards and click on that, and that will take you to a website that is dedicated to all things water loss. And it's essentially a sub-site. And if you click on audit tools, that will take you to this page, and there's the tool that we're talking about. If you haven't checked out the water loss switchboard, I highly recommend it. It's got a lot of free tools. It's kind of a clearinghouse for water audit related information and tools that we've gathered from around the country. So if you've got questions about different aspects of water auditing, there's a very good chance you're going to find your answers there. But back to our data sheets. So as I said earlier, the volume from own sources data grade is about metering policy, practices, and procedures. And although I talked about them in general terms, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about this one in particular, just so that you can see how these are laid out. And again, this is volume from own sources. Every other data point, even ones that are related to metering, are going to be somewhat different. So we've got 4 sets of criteria. What's highlighted in yellow right now is the percentage of metered sources, and you can see that there's an ascending scale from less than 25 up to 100%. It's not quite evenly distributed. In red, we've got testing frequency for your meters. So starting at no regular and ending up at the other end at semi-annual tests. And you'll notice if you dig into this, there's questions about meter testing or electronic calibration, and then at some point it becomes meter testing and then it becomes meter testing and electronic calibration. In blue here, we have information about meter accuracy, which you can see doesn't even kick in here until a grade of 6, which basically means you've got annual meter testing and at least 75% of your production sources are metered. So you can see again that although meter testing is an important aspect of this particular data grade, it's not even considered until you get halfway through the grading criteria. And then last but not least, we've got our third-party review, which is one of the criteria you need to meet, make a grade of 10 on this particular data point. So just like I said with the water audit version, you determine whether you meet or exceed the criteria listed on each line. If it's yes, you check off the box. If no, you leave the box blank. You skip the in-between boxes, and your data grade is going to be either the highest grade with all of the boxes checked, or an in-between grade if you happen to have all of one set checked and a few of the next one. So as an example, in this particular case here, I've got everything checked on 1, 2, and 4. My data grade is a 4. Let's say this was my audit last year. I've improved my processes, added a few more meters. So now I can check off, 2 of the 3 listed criteria for 6. Well, I can't check off that last one because maybe I don't have the requisite accuracy in my meter testing. So I've got all of 4, sum of 6. My data grade is a 5. It's relatively straightforward. But again, you kind of have to be meticulous and read the criteria and see exactly what they mean. And I mentioned at the very beginning that there is some interpretation sometimes required, and this is an example of that particular issue. Again, these are criteria that were put together by a group of experts in water loss control, and sometimes you have to kind of think sort of more deeply about what they were trying to figure out. Now I'm looking at testing frequency criteria here, and you can see I've got no regular, occasional, annual, and semi-annual. And you'll notice that there is no category for regular testing. It goes straight from no regular to occasional. So what's the difference between the two? Because if you look it up in the dictionary, occasional means infrequent or regular. In other words, not regular. So from a straight up grammar sense, these two things mean exactly the same thing, but obviously in context, they're meant to mean something different. So this is again where that sort of interpretation has to come in, because the steps are no regular, occasional, and annual. We can tell here that occasional means something more than not regular, but something less than annual. And this actually is defined as testing that's happened within the last 5 years, but less than annually. But to find that definition, you end up having to go to a resource outside of the audit itself. Another plug for the technical assistance part of this program that is free. If you're having issues with interpretation, or you have some questions about how things should be interpreted, feel free to reach out to any of us. We can help you with this. So the third option for doing the data grading is a tool that tries to build that interpretation into the process, and also tries to let you do the grading kind of in a vacuum, where you're not really paying attention to what the scores are. You're just paying attention to the criteria and whether you meet them. This is another Excel spreadsheet that we've developed that uses a relatively simple question and answer format to determine data grades. And over here on the left-hand side are the questions related to the specific data point. And then on this side here, there are pull-down menus. You click on it, you basically choose the most applicable answer. And once you've answered all the questions, it spits out the score for you. Now, the data grading sheet tool that I just showed you is an exact duplicate of the water audit software. So if you do the data grading in those PDF sheets, you are guaranteed to have the exact same answer as you would if you use the water audit software. Because of the interpretational factor here, there is a slight possibility that you might get a point higher or point lower on any of the given criteria, because again, we've had to sort of account for that interpretational aspect. That being said, I really like this approach because, again, you're sort of doing the evaluation without looking at the scores. We recognize that you're looking for high scores in all of these, but I think if you use this approach, there's less of an emphasis on what the grade is there's less of an opportunity to sort of game the system and sort of change the criteria for the number that you want. It helps you do a straight evaluation. This tool is also on the water loss switchboard site that I showed you earlier. It's literally right next to the other grading sheets. It's the one in the middle here. Recommend doing that. It's kind of an interesting side note. Version 6 of the water audit software that Dawn mentioned this morning actually uses this approach. They've adopted a somewhat similar approach of question and answer interactive grading. The nice thing about that is that it's built in, but since Tennessee is working on, still working with version 5 of the software, we've got a tool here that allows you to do that kind of assessment sort of off audit and then enter those data grades into the audit. And you can always use multiple tools to do the grading just to make sure that you are coming up with consistent answers as well. So you've entered your grades, now what? We move on to the data validity score, which is that cumulative score that I was talking about. It's the global assessment of the complete audit, and it's still qualitative. It's a number, but it's a qualitative number. It's a summation of those weighted individual data validity grades. It's out of 100, but again, not a test score, not a value judgment. It's that qualitative proxy for quantitative accuracy. A lower score implies lower accuracy and a higher score implies higher accuracy, but it doesn't tell you exactly how accurate or inaccurate you are. And in some cases, it can be just simply wrong. Because it's based, again, on this policy and procedure review, and there is a bit of an emphasis or bias toward high-level automation. And for smaller systems in particular, sometimes investing in that high-level automation just isn't economically feasible or warranted. So I've seen systems that have incredibly accurate data and many relatively manual procedures, and they end up in a situation where the data score doesn't necessarily reflect accurately the accuracy of their data. Excuse me. So again, not a statistical analysis. 90 DVS or data validity score does not mean you have a 90% accuracy level, but it is sort of a qualitative relative assessment. The score is going to show up at the bottom of the audit reporting sheet. It'll sit there in red. If you have missed a couple of data grades or one or more, it will inform you that you have additional points that still need to be graded. It's not going to tell you which one, but they're on the same page, so it's really not that hard to find. Just scroll up and track down where you're missing a data grade. The data validity score also shows up on the performance indicator tab. And the official definition is that it's the cumulative score designed to serve as a measure of the overall validity of the input data of the audit. Remember, validity, not accuracy. Gives you a relative understanding. Is an 80 better than a 50? Sure, probably, but is an 80 necessarily better than a 75 or a 78? Maybe not. And that's kind of the hitch with qualitative assessment. It makes the process of evaluating the inputs easier, and it does give you good information and a general sense of how good your data is, but it is harder to interpret than a confidence level margin of error type of situation. And so just keep that in mind. What's the downside of low scores? It's highly unlikely. I'm assuming that in Tennessee, somebody's going to end up with a 49 who's required to do this because you've been doing auditing for a decade now, and there is this emphasis on getting relatively high scores. The rule of thumb is that any score under 50 indicates that you should probably be prioritizing improving your data. There is the development of the audit for state purposes. There is the development of the audit for internal purposes, reducing water loss. And you want to be able to interpret your results correctly so that if you take action based on your audit and other factors that you're taking the appropriate action. And generally, if you've got a score under 50, the appropriate action to take is work on developing the data and increasing your data validity score overall. But what about a situation like this where you've got a 78? So on the one hand, you're pretty close to the margin set by the state. What do you do? And the point here is that you have to decide where to focus your efforts. And the audit gives you some guidance that should improve the usefulness of your results. It provides some priority areas for increasing your data validity score. And the areas will be listed on the bottom left-hand side of the page. And these are typically the items where your grades are lowest and where the impact will be highest. There is also a data grading matrix tab, which is a companion to those suggested areas for improvements. And it lays out in relatively good detail the types of actions you can take to improve individual data grades and thereby impact the overall score. Now notice I said improve the data grades. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to improve the accuracy or the underlying accuracy of those data points, but there should be a relationship between them. For each data grade is listed on the left. There's going to be a series of improvements, and the box that's highlighted in yellow is going to be the set of criteria associated with moving your system from the grade you have to the next highest grade. It's important to understand that these are general recommendations. They're not mandatory. They're not really prioritized, and they certainly aren't system specific. Every system sees the exact same matrix. So if you got a 6 or a 7 on volume from own sources, you're going to see this exact same box. And again, they're suggestions that should lead to improved data. But whether you take those recommendations or the order that you do those recommendations in is entirely dependent on your goals and your budget and other constraints. You also have to look at why you have the lower score and what the audit is telling you. So again, on volume from own sources, to qualify for an 8, you can see the sort of listed criteria here and how it dovetails with the grading criteria. It says do your meter testing annually on calibration on a regular basis. But it also has this suggestion to complete a project to install new or replace defective existing meters and repair or replace meters that are outside plus or minus 6% accuracy. So you've got a couple of different things here that are suggested, and you have to decide which concrete actions you want to take and why you're taking them. Are you doing it to get a better understanding of the water loss that's happening in your system? Are you doing it to get a higher data grade to satisfy the state? Are you doing it for both reasons? And also realize that if you're doing it for the water loss understanding or water loss control side of things, there are a whole lot of things that you can do that aren't even addressed in this matrix for improving data grades, because what's addressed in the matrix is directly associated with the criteria that are in the data grades themselves. So for example, tracking main breaks is not addressed in the audit, but it's a highly effective way of gathering data that can help you reduce real water loss and, as an aside, evaluate the condition of your infrastructure over time. But that's not a criteria that's going to be listed in here. So you could start doing that, have a very positive impact on your water loss control, and have it not necessarily improve your overall data validity score, because those criteria really aren't addressed in the data validity score. And it's important to remember that the water audit is one part of a water loss control program, which is a much bigger picture. Again, Heather's going to be digging into this, but you have to make your decisions about how you're going to react to both loss numbers and data validity issues in the context of the big picture and the priorities that you've hopefully set. And sometimes there's a little bit of a chicken egg situation here. The data grades can actually help you determine what your priorities are and how you set them. But you may have some conflict and decide that the order of priorities that you set, although maybe it won't have as big an impact on your data validity score as you would like, is nonetheless appropriate for you. recognize that
James.
some improved. Yes.
I just want to stop you there just for a moment. You're getting a little quiet. I don't know if you can put yourself a little bit closer to the microphone. Some folks are having trouble hearing you. So if you could just
Okay.
get closer.
Is that any better?
Let's see. Try it again.
Is this any better?
Not a whole lot.
Okay, let me try something here. I am going to
microphones. How about now? Is this any better?
I think that's better. So let's try that and see how that goes for a little bit.
All right, thanks. If we consider our prior meter example, where to qualify for an 8, we'd have to replace meters that are outside the plus or minus 6% accuracy range. You might have to consider whether or not you have bigger fish to fry. If you've got good meter testing data and you know that, for example, a particular meter is maybe running at just outside that range, maybe it's running at 7% under registration, you have to decide, is it important to replace that meter or repair that meter so that it runs inside the accuracy range to get the higher data grade, or is it good enough to just know what the accuracy is so that you can adjust accordingly? The point here is evaluate the actions that are going to be most impactful for your system at the time based on your goals, because you're probably not going to be able to do everything that you want at any given time. And data grading criteria can sort of provide an outline and a set of options, but which options you take is going to be entirely up to you. So quick review of the data grading. Each point has a grade associated with it, even if it's calculated by the software. There are 20 possible grades. They're going to be non-applicable or 1 to 10. Each grade has its own qualitative criteria that you have to assess individually. Can't emphasize that enough. Those scores get combined together for a total data validity score out of 100. Some of those individual data grades are going to have a bigger impact on the overall data validity score than others. The audit is going to suggest some methods for improving data grades, which may improve accuracy, but might not. And again, you have to make your decisions in the context of the overall water loss control program. And again, in the context of the state's requirements, because the state has determined that you have to have a data validity score above 80 to avoid referral to these boards. They've sort of drawn this line in the sand, but it's important to remember that the better you understand why you have a specific set of grades, the better off you're going to be if you're in that situation and you have to explain yourself to the board. And it will help you also understand and be able to come up with suggested solutions in that discussion with the board. The feasibility of certain actions, the affordability, the logistics of some improvements may take time, they may not be possible. As long as you understand how you got to where you are, you're going to be in a much better position than a system who just sort of randomly assigned a bunch of numbers in order to meet that state goal. You want to understand what you need to do to increase your data validity score, but you also want to understand what it is that you're doing that got you there in the first place. There's always going to be ways to improve it, but you want to do that in a well thought out manner. Before we jump into our short break, again, I want to emphasize being realistic about your data grading. It's an assessment of policies, practice, and procedures. From our standpoint, the right data grade is the one that accurately reflects your practices. It's not a value judgment, it's just an evaluation of what is and an opportunity to analyze what you do, why you do it, and how effective it is. So, as you're doing this data grading process, really pay attention to what's going on in your system, gather and evaluate your policies and procedures as you're completing the audit for the grading for your audit. And because really that's, in my opinion, the best part of the whole data grading process. It really gives you an excuse to sort of sit down and look at what you do and why you do it and how successful it is. So with that, we'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about data grades before we move on. All right. So I'm just going to take a few minutes here to talk about the quantitative side of things. As I pointed out at the beginning, we've got our 3 V's: outcome of the water audit itself. But the one thing that it doesn't really address is that accuracy component. So, it's that qualitative proxy. So we're going to take a few minutes talking about the qualitative side of the audit that the audit, sort of addresses somewhat indirectly. And I'll address assessing the inputs for accuracy in light of system goals and how you can use the cues that we just talked about in the data grading criteria to try and limit that error, whether that error is sneaking in due to quirks in data, or maybe because you just don't even have certain data in a format that's easily usable. But first, I want to look at the way the audit presents those KPIs or key performance indicators, and what you should or maybe shouldn't take away from those. So there's a performance indicator tab in the audit that sort of summarizes a list of key performance indicators: apparent loss, real loss, the criteria that you need for your state requirements, losses as a percentage by cost of operating the system, and your data validity score. And the way these are presented, they look sort of very authoritative and exact. They're all presented as single values. Some of them go out to 2 decimal places. So here, for example, my real losses tells me I've got 26.75 gallons per connection per day down here in this criteria. And again, your main and sort of only clue or cue about the reliability of the results is that data validity score, which for some reason on the KPIs is at the top of the page, not the bottom of the page. And in this example, it's a 60, well below the Tennessee data requirements. But what if instead it's a 79? What does that tell you? Well, on the one hand, it tells you that you're very close to meeting your state's data validity score requirement, obviously much closer than a 60 would be, and that your results are fairly valid using the data validity standard. The implication being that, this version of the audit with a 79 is more valid than the prior that had a 60. But you may have noticed that none of these numbers change. The KPIs here and in the prior example are all the same because the underlying data is the same. So how much better is this really? And that is a little bit harder to suss out. We're using the audit to try and find out information about our real losses, and it presents it to us as sort of a definitive number. But what we really want to know from a quantitative standpoint is, if my audit tells me I've got 300 million gallons of real loss, is the number it's giving me fairly close to the actual value? Is it sort of close, or is that a number that just happens to be in the middle of a very wide range of possibilities? Essentially what I'm talking about here is the margin of error, which the audit doesn't give us. And it's important to think about this because one of the outcomes of doing auditing is taking action. And the actions that you might take to address this real loss volume in these 3 different instances is likely going to be very different. If you've got sort of a narrow band of accuracy, you can be much more assured that the actions that you take are probably going to have an impact on that loss. If you're on the right-hand side of the screen, however, and that 300 number is in the middle of a really big range, you might want to focus more on improving your data and narrowing that accuracy range so that the actions you take actually have some impact, because there are situations where an audit will seem to indicate that you have one problem, but because of the sort of garbage in, garbage out issue, if you had problems with the data that went into the inputs, you're going to have problems with the outputs as well. So think about that and recognize that you can, get to a different data validity score a lot of different ways. What I'm talking about here is this sort of qualitative quantitative divide that is present in the audit. So From a qualitative standpoint, we've got the data validity side of things that makes it easier to do the assessment. But from a quantitative side, what we really want is accurate results. And for accurate results, we need to have accurate data going in. Now, no audit is going to be perfect. There is you're basically trying to do a mass balance on a citywide system or a townwide system. There's going to be some level of error, and the sort of inherent accuracy of the audit is limited. And those limitations are due to a number of factors. One of the main limitations is the quality of the data going in. Because a lot of the data that water systems maintain isn't necessarily maintained with a water auditing context in mind. So when you're looking at improving your data and making it more useful, you really have to balance your efforts with your outcomes. Consider both the qualitative and the quantitative aspects of the water audit data when you're completing your audit, when you're reviewing your audit, and most importantly, when you're deciding what actions to take based on the audit and other factors, because of course the audit is just, as I said, one piece of the bigger puzzle. There are a lot of tools that you can use to assess that quantitative aspect. We'll be talking about them more in later sessions, but there's a tool for doing a 95% confidence analysis that will give you these statistical error band ranges. There's a leakage component analysis model that you can do where you're essentially building your loss numbers from the bottom up by looking at event data, assuming you have that data to actually work on. The point here is to think about why you do what you do when you're evaluating your data grades and how you're going to improve them, and think about those in the context of what you're trying to achieve, both from a state requirement perspective and an internal water loss controls perspective, because those are intimately related ideas. And this sort of goes to sort of the qualitative-quantitative connection. Even though there is a bit of a divide in the audit between these qualitative and quantitative aspects, I think as we demonstrated above when we were walking through the criteria, there is a connection between the two as well. So, even though the data validity scoring is a qualitative assessment, it does impact the quantitative aspects of the audit, at least indirectly, and those qualitative criteria can provide you clues about and guidelines for improving your audit data's quantitative aspects. So let's look at an example of some of the goals that you might have and how those might be addressed. You've all got a state mandated goal to keep that non-revenue water below 20% by cost threshold. A related goal is going to be meeting that data validity score minimum. And two things that you're going to have to be able to do that are being able to look at these two distinct data points, volume from own sources and the corresponding meter adjustment, because if you can't measure it, you can't put that information in. So, and why do we want to look at these? Well, big meters can overread, they can underread, depending on how they are installed. You might have multiple sources, the errors are going to be different. So in addition to sort of those qualitative aspects you need for the data validity grade, you have to consider the quantitative aspects of meter testing and how that's going to impact your actual audit results. So let's say you are testing, and the big question from a quantitative standpoint is, what are you doing with the data that you're collecting, and how are you going about collecting it? We see a lot of this kind of result related to source meter testing. Meters pass inspection if they read within plus or minus 2%, and the only record that's maintained is that they passed. In some cases, I've actually seen records maintained in a database that say we have 100% accuracy as long as we're inside this range, which is obviously not exactly correct. So let's say this is the situation on all your source meters. You're testing annually and everything is within that range. You're good to go, right? Well, in the one sense, yes, and on the other sense, no. It all depends on really what you're trying to achieve. From that data validity score qualitative assessment, that's awesome, because with that kind of test result, it's possible to get a 10 on that data grade. But from a quantitative viewpoint, you could still have quite a bit of uncertainty on the actual value for that data point, particularly if all you have are the records that they passed. In other words, you don't know, did it read 101% or 98%? What you know is that you've got test data to meet the qualitative requirements, and that your meters are relatively accurate somewhere within a 4% range. You've got a possible range of error. If you stop there, you really don't know how big it is, and whether you're overreading or underreading, or you're spot on, and how that's impacting the results of your audit. And that can be kind of problematic, especially since small errors scattered throughout the audit sort of can combine to really cumulatively mess with your results. So let's just look at source metering and what happens in the audit if you're over registering by 2% and maybe don't know it, because all you've got is information that your meters passed. Well, first off, you're not going to have the ability to adjust for the error correctly. And so you've effectively lost 2% of your reported volume, because you over registered. You put more into the system than it's possible to get out. And so the only way you're going to gain that back is if you maybe had over registration on the output side, but that's relatively unlikely, because most customer meters are going to tend to under register. So that's not going to give you that much help. And so what you end up with is, starting with a number that is too big for you to account for everything. Where did that go? And I think this is worth sort of stepping through really briefly to understand how the error would flow through the audit, so that you can understand this. So if, let's say, you had 100,000 acre feet coming from your own sources, if you over registered, your actual volume is somewhere around 98,000, which means you've got 2,000 acre feet of over registration. If you're using the default values in the audit, a small portion of that's going to show up in apparent loss, because it calculates apparent loss based on the volume from own sources. A small portion of that is going to show up as theft, because that data point, when you're using the audit default, is also based on the volume from own sources. But and there's going to be some in systematic data handling error, but most of it's going to show up as real loss. And because you literally cannot account for this, because it's an over input, you've essentially set yourself up to have more loss on paper than you have in reality. And if you're not aware of why you have that number, you may have just sent yourself to go off on a snipe hunt, looking for losses that don't actually exist. So something to think about. These are going to flow through. Some is going to show up in apparent loss, but the vast majority is going to show up in real loss. If your meters are under registering, you basically get the exact same results in reverse. All of those numbers show up as negatives. Under registering gives you this sort of rosy picture that is unrealistic, because it artificially reduces your real loss and makes things look better than they are, and essentially disguises loss. So now that we've established, obviously, that meter testing is important from a quantitative standpoint as well, let's circle back to that qualitative aspect, the grading and validation. This volume from own sources happens to be a very high data point in terms of the impact on the overall data validity score. Assuming that all of your sources are metered and you've got a rigorous testing program in which you actually keep all of your testing data so that you can do that adjustment. If you look at these criteria here, I sort of simplified them a little bit, but you realize that you could have very accurate data with any grade from on about 6 or so up, because even if your meters are testing outside that range, if they're doing that consistently, well, you can consistently account for that error and adjust for it, and make your audit results that much more accurate. There may be cases in which you actually over time decide to reduce testing frequency, because either the sources are infrequently used or the meters have been shown to be really consistent, and testing costs money, and you want to, instead of maybe testing twice a year, you decide I'm going to test once a year. Changing what you do is going to have an impact on your data validity score, even though it may not have an impact on the quantitative aspect of it. So, you might decide that from a qualitative aspect, a 6 isn't good enough, even though from a quantitative aspect, it's giving you the information you need. Obviously, if you're in that situation, the audit's going to point at some things that you can do. One of the actions might be meter testing a replacement, and the extent of what you do is really going to depend on what you need to get from the data and what you're comfortable with, and how much you can actually account for. Same thing with the meter adjustment side of things. There's some actions that you can take, but the error adjustment side of things has requirements about meter inventory data and the frequency of reads. If you're reading your meters frequently and your meters are accurate, does it really matter from a quantitative aspect if you know exactly when the meter was installed, or have all of the detailed meter inventory criteria? Maybe not. So again, just keep those things in mind. It's going to provide you with a variety of actions. One of the more important ones is probably going to be around meter reading frequency. If you only read your meters once a month, you've got the potential for errors lasting a month. If you read your meters once a week, you've reduced that possibility of long-term error by a factor of 4. The biggest thing that you can do for any of these, whether it impacts that qualitative data grade or not, is to really pay attention to your data. Increasing data review frequency, making sure that you carefully determine where your source data is coming from, whether everything is included, whether summary data has been prepared correctly, because for each of these data points, you've got one input in the audit, and you want to make sure that whatever went into developing that number is as accurate as it possibly can be. And if you leave all of that until the end of the year, it makes it very difficult, because you're dealing with large volumes of data, and finding the error, which in this case happens to be a little 3 here in the middle, is more difficult just because of the volume of data you're looking at. If you look at it in more frequent chunks, those errors are going to be easier to spot, and usually errors in the data or often will point to operational errors that are happening out in the field. So if you wait until the end of the year to look for those errors, there's no way to correct for them. So, again, think about those internal goals, your external goals, what the audit is telling you, and how you can positively impact qualitative and quantitative aspects of your audit. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Heather, and we'll talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of using default values in the audit.
Okay, great. So we want to focus a little bit on the defaults. So James had talked earlier about the fact that there are defaults in the audit, and we want to take a bigger look at the defaults. So the audit itself has 3 possible defaults, and one is unbilled, unmetered usage. And this is basically that usage that you have to have, flushing your pipes, flushing for quality, firefighting, testing hydrants, flushing after a break, maybe flushing your wells at the beginning. So we expect this kind of usage, but we're not necessarily metering all of it. Sometimes we're having to estimate how we're getting that flow based on amount of time or something like that. And we have another default that's related to unauthorized consumption, or what we sometimes call as theft. And the last default is systematic data handling errors. So the defaults were built in to make the audit a little bit easier so that you didn't have to collect data. So we want to show you on the screen now of how many people in Tennessee have used the defaults. And this is based on all the audits that were turned in, James did a little analysis and figured out that 54% of the folks who turned in audits were using the one for unbilled, unmetered, 94% were using unauthorized consumption defaults, and 75% were using systematic data handling error defaults. So now we have a poll question just to find out for the folks who are online with us here today. Are you guys using the default or not in your audit? So James, if you want to start that poll question. And so you can just, it's a real simple one, yes, no, or you're not sure, you don't know. So if you're not the one who actually does the audit, you might not be aware of whether whether you've used the default or not. So again, just type yes, no, or you're not sure. All right, a few more need to answer. So if you can just take a moment and just click yes, no, or not sure. All right, well, we'll go ahead and close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Go ahead and close the poll. And let's share results. So we've just had mostly we don't know or we're not sure is the answer that's most common for this one for the unauthorized consumption default. And we had 1 yes and 1 no. All right, so we can stop sharing those results. So I'm going to ask you a question now, and this is a great chance to use the unmute feature. So we want to look at why might people want to use the default for unauthorized consumption. So why might you choose to put the default value in? And remember, if we use the default, we don't have to enter any information. And this is all about theft. So why would we choose to use the default on the audit? What would be the reason that we might want to do it? And again, you can unmute yourself and I'll even turn on my camera so that I can say hi to everybody. So just share with me some ideas of why might you want to use the default for the audit for the theft.
Simplicity's sake.
I'm sorry?
Simplicity's sake.
Yeah, simplicity's sake, absolutely. You know, if we were doing like the game show where they always had the highest answer, that's probably one, you know, one of the #1 reasons is simplicity. What are other reasons that you might want to use the default for theft? How easy is it to get data on theft?
Nobody has any theft, Heather. Everyone's just super squeaky clean out here in East Tennessee. So.
All right, no theft going on. How about any good theft stories? Anybody have a good theft story? It's always fun to share some theft stories. Customers can be very, very creative with stealing from you. So anybody have any good stories on how people have stolen from you? Like if you have actually tried to track theft, what have you found? And I know that you guys can use your mics because you just did it. So go ahead and share. Anybody have a good story on theft? That's always fun to kind of find out what's going on in each other's systems. And we had some good ones in the last couple of sessions that we did in other parts of Tennessee, where one that I had never heard before. Sometimes you hear the same kinds of theft stories at different places, but the one that was shared in West Tennessee was a customer who got really mad at the utility and decided to solve their problem by pouring concrete into the meter pit so that you can no longer see the meter. So I guess they figured if the meter couldn't be seen and couldn't be read, they couldn't be charged. So I thought that was an interesting one that I hadn't heard. But we had people who turned the meter backwards and people who pulled out the meter and put in straight pipe. Any good East Tennessee theft stories?
So much on the theft, but back to why you would want to use the default is when you find those connections like you just talked about, I mean, it's very obvious whether it's found by meter reading or whatnot. But I think the hardest one to detect is the use of the hydrants, whether they be construction companies or things of that nature, because they come and go and they'll pick a different hydrant, and in that one it's very difficult to track down.
And that's a great point. It can be really, really hard to find that kind of theft. So, you know, sometimes just the fact that it's really hard to know what's going on in your system, I think is another reason, as you mentioned, for why you'd want to use the default. So I'll share some things that have been said in other sessions that we've done in other parts of Tennessee. So don't believe it's a very high volume, not worth the effort, simplicity, which was mentioned, difficult to quantify the amount of theft. So there are reasons why it's 94% used in Tennessee. And we kind of had some of our own reasons that were very similar to yours. One of which is that it provides a data grade of 5. So in this particular version of the audit, in version 6, that's not true anymore. But in version 5, which is being used in Tennessee, it does provide a data grade of 5, and your own data might end up actually being lower than a data grade of 5, especially if, you know, it's hard to get this kind of data. So if you were grading it yourself, you might actually end up with a lower grade than the default. That is one of the reasons they changed it in version 6. And you don't need to collect data and that sort of thing. So similar to what was mentioned before, just ease is a big part of it. So let's look at the other side of the coin. So why might we want to collect data to move away from using the default? So we've talked about how it's easy to use the default in the water audits, but why might we want to move away from using the default? You know, what would be good for our system? So now kind of put on a bigger lens, instead of just thinking about the audit itself, how would it help our system if we started looking a little bit more carefully at unauthorized usage or theft? How could that help our system? So is there any benefit to kind of collecting information about theft, for example? So, you know, what benefits exist if you start collecting data or start looking for theft? You know, what benefits are there to doing that? What was typed in is focus on finding theft and actually addressing the issue. Absolutely. If you don't know what's happening, it's really hard to put any controls in place to try to address the issue. So if we don't know anything about what's going on, how do we figure out what to put in place? So I think if we go back to the hydrant question, there was a system we worked with in Oklahoma, and that particular system was having a lot of trouble with theft on the hydrants. And they felt like they were losing a lot of water, and people were never coming in and getting the meter and paying for the usage. They were just hooking up to a hydrant and taking the water. And what they ended up doing is, after they started putting the word out in the community to you know, have their community members look more carefully at theft, they realized that there was quite a bit of it going on. They changed their whole practice so that the only hydrant that anybody could take water from was at the wastewater treatment plant behind a fence. And you had to go into the treatment plant, you had to get an operator, the operator would hook you up, and they would take a meter reading before and after. And they told the whole town to basically, you know, keep their eyes out. If anybody connected to a hydrant, they were stealing water, and to call the utility. And they felt like, you know, it definitely didn't 100% eliminate the theft, but it cut down the theft quite a bit when they did that practice. But until you start looking, you don't necessarily know about, you know, what's happening, and you don't know what control measures to take. Some utilities start, you know, locking hydrants as a response to that. But until you look, you don't really know.
Just thinking about
Go ahead.
Story that we have from Colorado where they had the flushing hydrant that was in a dead end line for potential future growth. And whenever they went to flush the line, they found a chlorine residual test kit sitting there. So they knew that someone was coming and stealing the water at that hydrant, and they were smart enough to not steal the water until they had flushed it long enough that it had chlorine residual in it. So that, the test kit sitting there meant that the people knew that the water could be bad quality until it was flushed long enough. But that got me to thinking, we're flushing our lines and maybe not knowing that we really don't need to because they've already been flushed for us because of the theft issue. So now we're not only losing water to theft, but we're losing water because now we're essentially flushing twice. So if we don't know what's going on at those hydrants, especially if they're on those dead end lines, which is where theft oftentimes occurs because they're kind of remote and not have eyes on them, that we really might be kind of double, losing water. So we're doing one on purpose and one's being stolen, but we may, one of them would not be necessary if the other wasn't happening. So it could be kind of a double-edged sword there whenever, thinking about that water quality, and they've already flushed for them when they stole that water. So I just kind of thought about that. That was a funny story that we heard about theft, was that not only were they smart enough to steal it at this remote location, they were smart enough to test the water before they stole it. But that made me think,
we have well-trained team.
That water that they didn't need to. So.
What about security and public health issues? Are there any of those related to theft? Security issues, public health issues. And you can use the chat box or the unmute feature. What are, do you feel like there's any of those kinds of concerns if you think about theft? We just don't have enough theft in East Tennessee. All right, so we'll move on to some of our answers. So there are security and public health potential risks with theft. So think about if you're connecting to a hydrant and you're stealing water, water's coming out. But if you're connected to the hydrant, there's also the potential for something to go in. So somebody can overcome the back pressure and put something in your system. They can either do that intentionally or unintentionally. So we have that kind of concern with our theft. If you think about other ways that people steal water, so sometimes they connect directly to your main. So if somebody's connecting directly to your main, there could be issues related to cross connections, depending on how they're connecting up, and maybe your town requires backflow preventers and that sort of thing. But if somebody's illegally connecting, they're not going to do it properly. So there's all kinds of issues that could occur just related to stealing water from you. So it's one of the things that you really want to be careful about, what kind of security and public health risks it might have. And if we start capturing some data, we can start doing a trend analysis over time. Do we start seeing more theft or less theft or staying the same over time? Like, did I see 5 incidences this year and I saw 8 the next and I saw 12 the next? Well, then maybe theft is increasing, or I'm just getting really better at finding it. Either way. It also, as you start to figure out how people are stealing water, you can change your practices. So in one community, they always read the meters on the same day of the month. So they just had certain routines and they were very, very routine. Like this neighborhood was read on the second Tuesday of every month, and that neighborhood was read on the third Thursday of every month. So the customers were very aware of when the meter reader was coming through town. And some of them had learned to take out the meter, put in straight pipe until like a couple of days before the meter reader came. In this particular place, they happened to be looking at meters when, for other purposes, actually water loss purposes, they were looking at meters and it wasn't the meter reading date, and they were finding people who had taken the meters out and put in straight pipe. So just changing, when you look at the meters can help identify theft. And if you start to see more incidences, you might want to take that approach and try to get more creative about how you do something, or even just send an operator to pop, every 10th meter or something, just to see if anything is happening. So it also opens up the possibility of having a continuous improvement process. And if we're just using the default, we're not really going to do any of this. We're not going to collect data. We're not going to look at control measures. We're not going to look at continuous improvement. It's really, we're just going to be out of sight, out of mind with our theft. So even though it's easy to do it in the audit, there are reasons why you don't want to keep sticking with that. You want to move away from the default. And in some cases, your theft is going to be higher than the default. In other cases, it's going to be lower. And so when you use your own values, you can adjust for what your real theft is instead of using a default. Because when you use the default, you don't really know anything about your system. You're just taking a wild guess and using somebody's idea of what theft would be, but you just don't have any idea if that's really what's going on in your system. So let's move on to the unbilled, unmetered usage. Maybe this is something you're a little more familiar with. And this is, again, that usage that is authorized. We expect it to be used, but it's things like flushing, firefighting, testing hydrants, street sweeping, things like that. So if you use this default, say yes. If you don't, choose no. And if you're not sure or you don't know, just select that answer. So go ahead and take a moment just to answer this question. And this was one where I believe we were at 54%. So it's roughly slightly more than half the people in Tennessee use this default. And the rest of the folks have their own value that they put in. And just while you're taking the quiz, I'll just let you know that my pug has entered the room and he's starting to snore. So if you hear any noise in the background, it's my snoring pug in the chair behind me. He likes to come to work. He really likes COVID has been a godsend to him, because then he gets to spend the day in my office, which he would never get to do if I was at the university. So it looks like we have most of the folks. James, if you want to stop the poll. So similarly to what we see in Tennessee, we're kind of evenly split between using the default and not. And then we have several folks who aren't sure. All righty. So let's move on to kind of the same questions of why might we want to use this default? So why would we want to use the default for unbilled, unmetered usage? What are some reasons why we might want to use this default? And you can chat in your reasons, or you can unmute to share reasons why you would use this default.
So we know two folks said they were using the default, so maybe they can share why they choose to.
Yeah, so if you're one of the folks who said you're using the default, why are you choosing to use the default? If you would chat in or unmute, just give us some idea of why you've chosen to use the default, which there's nothing wrong with it. We're not making any value judgments whatsoever. We're just talking about reasons why you would or wouldn't use the default. So what are some reasons why, for the couple of folks who are using it, why have you chosen to use the default? All right, well, I will share some reasons why others in other parts of Tennessee have, oh, here we go. Difficulty in measuring how much water is used during firefighting, main breaks, etc. Definitely, it can be difficult to measure those kinds of uses, especially if your fire department doesn't collect a lot of data and share it with you. I know that that was brought up in, I think it was our last training in Central Tennessee, where the fire department wasn't sharing data with them. So they really couldn't get any information about, how much water was used during fires, or when the fire department tested hydrants, they didn't have any information. So it is really important, if you're going to try to get information, you have to have a really good relationship with the fire department, because they're using your water. And if they don't tell you, we had, 2 fires last month, and this is how much time we were pumping water out of our hoses, and this is how many trucks we had, you really will have no idea, how much water that might be. And you wouldn't even have a really good way to estimate it. So I think that's a good point, that if you don't know how much is used in firefighting, or if you're not tracking main breaks, for example, if whoever's fixing your main breaks and they're flushing, but they're not providing you the data, that makes it really difficult. Here's again some answers that came up in other sessions. There's not a feasible way to know exact flushing gallons on every hydrant, and that is true. Some of these items are occurring, but you're not sure how much. And some of our reasons were, again, it's easy, similar to the last one. It does provide a data grade of 5. You don't need to collect any data. And the actual number in the water audit is pretty small. So let's look at the other side of, for the folks who are not using the default, the folks who have their own data in there, what are some reasons why you've chosen to go with your own data? And I'll just put some of our thoughts on the screen, and maybe you have some others. So if you have some additional thoughts about, why you're choosing not to use the default, some of the things we came up with is knowledge of what's actually happening at your system. And that's what you really want. We really want to know the actual usage at the system rather than the default. And yours is very likely to be higher or lower. It's unlikely to be the same as the default. So as we move away from the default, we can actually know what's happening at your system. We can also examine whether some uses should be metered. So if you recall, this particular item is unbilled, unmetered usage. So that means that we're pretty much putting everything in this category of things that shouldn't, or things that are hard to meter on a permanent basis. So if we find out there's a usage for which that's not true, like let's say we're watering a park, or we're providing water to a ball field, something like that, where there's always water going there, or to a fountain, a fountain in the city center, and water's always going there, and we weren't metering it because we didn't send a bill. We want to move away from that, because we want those permanent uses of water to be metered. So even if we're not sending a bill, we still want to know how much water is going through there, because that will help us with the auditing, and it'll help us figure out if something's going wrong. So if all of a sudden that usage goes up, we know that there could be a problem, maybe a big leak or something like that. So, or somebody's connected to the pipe and we didn't know about it. So we want to be able to tell if some uses should be metered. And generally we are required to have this type of flow. So we really want to see if water is being used appropriately. Is there more flushing or less flushing than there should be? And that's another thing we can track over time. If you're looking at, say, monthly numbers for this usage, you can kind of see if people are slacking off and not doing the flushing properly. Or if you think they're doing too much flushing, over time, you can start looking at this. And again, it's a chance to look at policies, procedures, and practices. And we can get the grading above 5 if we don't use the default, and it opens up that continuous improvement process. So our last default is data handling errors, and let's see if people are using the default for data handling errors. And data handling errors are basically when you're using your billing system, it has to do with the meter readings getting to the billing system getting to the customers, and all of these sort of processes around your collection of that usage data and the billing system. So it's that type of data handling. Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll. So we have a couple more using the default than not, and then again, some folks that aren't sure. All right, so we're gonna kind of go through the same questions. I'm just gonna put our answers up for reasons to use this particular default on data handling. If you have other reasons why you've used the default, please go ahead and chat them in or unmute. But basically it's easy, it doesn't take effort to use the default. You get the data grade of 5, you don't have to collect a lot of data. And this one, sometimes we have trouble working with the billing systems. We've seen that in some systems where there's just not a good relationship with the billing system. And sometimes that's a reason if you use the default, you don't have to work with those folks. It's not a good reason necessarily, but sometimes that's a reason just because it's sometimes hard to get answers from them. And so we're going to move on to the other side of why might we want to move away from using data handling errors. So in this case, the billing system, is the cash register for the community. So if there's any errors in the system and we use the default, maybe we're not going to find them because we're not proactively looking for mistakes in the billing system. And this is something we've seen before. One utility that I saw actually forgot to put in to the billing system the rate increase. So when we came in to do a billing system audit and we were looking at the billing system, something wasn't making sense. And we figured out that even though the rate had been increased, that whoever was programming the system didn't program in the right bill. So just looking at the billing system showed that they were giving up a whole bunch of revenue, and it was quite a bit because the error was on commercial customers who were being charged much higher rates than the residential customers. And so, when that got fixed, there was going to be a pretty big increase in revenues. And handling errors can occur on the collection side. So basically during meter reading, and if there is an error that's going forward, we need to address that because again, this is where the revenue comes in. So if we're making a mistake in how we're collecting the data, we want to fix that. And again, it is an opportunity to examine your policies, procedures, and practices as part of the data grading. And we can get above 5 if we don't use the default. And it does open up a continuous improvement process that doesn't exist when the default is used. So again, it's really about knowing what's happening in your system as opposed to just kind of putting the blinders on and not, wanting to dig into it or be aware of it. So anytime we can get away from using the default, that's a really good thing. And it's oftentimes just easier to start with the default. And if you're trying to address other data points in your audit, sometimes there are more important data points to address, like your volume of owned sources or your meter errors, that type of thing. But once you get those addressed, the next place you'd want to go is kind of moving away from the defaults and trying to have a little bit more opportunity to dig into your data and see what you can learn about your system as a whole. So I think we're going to take a few minute break here, and then we'll have our next part, which is looking into how the particular data grades, looking at sort of a bigger picture of the data grades. So James, if you can play us a little bit of music and everybody can take a stretch break and a bathroom break, we'll take 5 and resume. So we've talked about data grades and what data grades kind of do for you in your audit. So one purpose for doing information related to data grades is to benefit that overall validity score and help your audit, get you a higher score. But there might be a larger purpose to doing some of the things that are related to data grades for the overall operation, maintenance, management, or finance of the system. So if we look at some of these grades, we want to kind of show, well, what do they do for the audit and what do they do for the bigger picture of the utility? And are there differences between grades and how they impact the audit versus how they impact the system? Because it can be very different. What happens in the audit can be very different from how it impacts your system. So let's look at some examples within the audit. So the first one we're going to look at is the length of mains. And just as a reminder of, the fact that there's a sheet that can go through helping you choose what data grade you should have, and what the data grade for length of mains is based on is things like paper or electronic records, the condition of the records, how the length of mains are calculated, the installations and abandonment tracking. So basically tracking the installation or abandonment of pipe, whether you have sound written policies for documenting new mains, permitting and commissioning new main installations, managing mains extensions and replacements, and then whether you have ways to verify the accuracy of electronic records through field activities. So now we're going to go to the spreadsheet and we're going to take a look at the data grading for this data point. And Don's going to pull up the water audit and walk us through what happens with the particular data point of length of mains.
I was muted. Is my screen showing correctly, Heather?
Yes, it is.
Great, thank you. So for length of mains, you can see that our overall data validity score with the inputs we have right now is at 26. And length of mains, we're starting at 1. And so I'm just going to kind of walk through what happens to the overall data validity score as we change the data grade for length of mains. So if we go from 1 to 2, still at a 26. If we go from 2 to 4, still at a 26. We go from 4 to 6, still at a 26. We go from 6 to 8. That's not an 8. 6 to 8. We go up to a 27. And if we go all the way up to our 10, the highest that we go up is that 1 point to the score of 27.
So if you would chat in, do you think that this particular data grade had a high, medium, or low impact on the actual audit and the validity score in the audit? So was it a high, medium, or low impact for the audit? So just go ahead and chat in high, medium, or low. Not even a lot of typing, just high, medium, and low. Or you can even write HML, that's fine too. You don't even have to type more. Oh, we got low. Any other thoughts? High, medium, or low impact? So essentially, no matter what you do with that data point, no matter how much better you make your policies or procedures, the best you're going to do is get 1 extra point on the data validity. And as James mentioned, these data grades are weighted. So in this particular case, you could spend a lot of effort, but you're going to get 1 data point. So you might ask yourself, is it really worth spending time and effort on this data point if I'm not going to get anything more than 1 extra point in data validity? Why would I want to spend time doing these kinds of things? But what we want to think about is, if I put up here all the things that go into the length of mains data point, are there reasons for the bigger utility where I might want to do this effort, even if it doesn't get me but 1 point on the data validity? Is it still worth it for me to do some of these things? So let's pick out one. And there's one on permitting and commissioning new main installations. So if your community allows a developer to put in new mains, and then at the end of that process, they turn the mains over to you, and then you have to operate and maintain those mains from that point forward, you know, would you want to have a good process for permitting and installing those mains to make sure that they're actually put in with good pipe, they're put in the way you want them to be done, you know, using the construction practices that you allow, you know, and one good example is my neighborhood. I always love to share my neighborhood because there's so many breaks in my neighborhood. We have really crappy pipe that was put in by the developer. And essentially the developer figured they would be here for about 20 years and then they'd be gone. And the pipe was designed to last about 20 years, which is about what it's been. And now there are just pipe breaks constantly. So Jimmy typed in yes, that, you know, you do want to know about this process. So even though it only gets you 1 point on your audit, it is really, really important that you know what's happening and that you don't get poor quality mains. Let's think about verifying the accuracy of electronic records through field activities. So if you have a GIS system, sometimes the GIS system or a mapping system, sometimes that system is pretty accurate, lets you know what all's going on. And other times that GIS system is kind of how you wish it was. So there's a big difference between, excuse me, you know, accuracy between system and system. And sometimes they're just, the lines are put in where you think they are, but nobody ever goes out to the field to verify it. So that can be a real problem if you want to do tracking of breaks, for example, and you have a location of a break, it has to tie to a main. So we need a main in the right place so we can put the brakes on it. If you're doing that 811, you know, the one call so that before you dig, somebody knows where your mains are and you have to spot them. The more accurate your information is, the easier that process is going to be. So having somebody go out in the field, and oftentimes when somebody's doing work on your pipe, they have that great information about what's happening in your system, but if they don't share it with you, it just stays in their head and you never know. So you really want to make sure that you get that information transmitted back to your, you know, your electronic map. So let's think about decommissioning mains. So if we abandon a main, there are utilities that I have talked to where people have accidentally connected customers to the abandoned main because they haven't kept good records of what's abandoned and what's not. And that could be a really bad thing. We don't want to be, you know, hooking people up to the wrong main. So we really want to make sure we're tracking what is active and what's not if we're abandoning in place and not taking the pipe out of the ground. Things like documenting new mains. If you only put a little bit of main in per year, you might say, well, it doesn't really matter. I don't have to document it. But if you go over time, 10 years down the road, now we've got a real problem because we've put in a bunch of main and we don't know where they are. If we think about length of mains, again, that might not sound like a really big deal, but mains are typically the most expensive thing that you have in your whole system. And they usually cost somewhere between about $500,000 a linear mile up to maybe $1.5 million. And possibly nowadays, I know construction costs have just been skyrocketing, so maybe they're even higher than that these days. So every mile of main, you've got to set aside money over time or plan for the replacement of all those mains. So if we say there's 10 miles of main at a, pick an easy number, $1 million a mile, that's $10 million. If there's 100 miles of main, we have to have $100 million. So if we don't know how many miles of pipe, and if we're even off by a little bit, that's a lot of money. So even, you know, saying 50 miles of pipe versus 55 miles of pipe, that's a $5 million difference. So having accurate information about the length of mains is really important to plan over time how you're going to replace those mains. And we need to replace them, you know, probably every 100 years. So we have to invest at about 1% of that total pipe cost on average every year. So again, understanding what the length of mains are can really help us. So in this case, even though it has very little impact on the water audit, it has a lot of impact on the system. So there's a big difference between, you know, let's do it for the system. There won't be much benefit on the audit side, but there's going to be a huge benefit on the system side. So we'll now look at another one, and this one is the volume from own sources. So I will show you the chart again for what goes into the volume of own sources, and the types of questions here are whether the water is imported or not. So if you import all of your water, obviously you don't have any volume of own sources. But if you do produce any water, you'll be in this category, even if it's only some of your water. What percentage of your sources are metered, how often meters are tested for accuracy or calibrated, the accuracy of your meters, and then whether the procedures are reviewed by a third party knowledgeable in M36. So we'll go again to the water audit. So Dawn, if you could take over and go to the water audit.
All right. So where we left off, we were at the score of 27, and volume from own sources is of course our first input on the audit spreadsheet. So we're way up here at the top, and we're starting at a 1. So if we go just up 1 to a 2, our overall data validity score has changed to a 30. And then if we go up to a 3, our overall score has changed to a 34. I'll skip a couple here. We'll go on up to a 5. Our score has gone up to 41. And then if we go to an 8, our score is now at 51. And if we go all the way up to the maximum of 10, the score goes all the way up to 58.
So here's another chance to answer the question we had posed before. So what is the impact of this particular data point? Is it high, medium, or low impact on the overall data validity score? And again, you can just use HML, 1-letter type. So is it a high, medium, or low impact on the overall data validity score? So we have an answer of high. I would agree with that. Look how much the data grade changed. And that was what, the 27 to a 58, I believe.
Correct.
So I think the math, if I'm doing it correctly, is a 31-point change. So there's quite a bit of change. And actually, don't want to give away the punchline here, but that has the most impact of any, you know, any data grade in the whole audit. The volume of own sources is going to have the most impact. So that one is really a high impact. So let's look at the other side of the coin. So we know it has a really high impact on the water audit, but how much impact does it have for the larger operation of the system? So if we go again to what is involved in this data grade, whether we import water, produce it, the percentage of meters, sources that are metered, how often we test the meter for accuracy or calibration, the accuracy of our meters, and whether the procedures are reviewed by a third party knowledgeable in the M36. So what are sort of some of the bigger implications for the utility around this? So the fact that, you know, how important is it for us to know exactly how much water we produce? You know, that sort of seems important to know how much water is being put into the system. But are we going to get a lot more than that out of it? So for the overall big picture of the system, yes, we do want to know what that supplied water is is, because then that helps us track what's happening in our system. But are we really going to get a whole lot further than that? So I think if you look at the two data points that we looked at thus far, you see almost the exact opposite. So the miles of main was not important at all for the audit, but very important for the overall operation of our utility. Whereas the volume of owned sources is incredibly important for our water audit, but maybe a little bit less so for the overall operation. So not to say it's not important, but it affects a very small segment of your system, whereas the mains affects a lot more of the system and a lot more overall. So Dawn, did you want to do one more before we move on to the applied activity?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so our last one we'll look at is billed metered usage. So this is that usage that our customers, we're sending them a bill, they have a meter. So this is another pretty important data point. And here again is the sheet for billed metered. And this is based on how many of the customers are actually metered, the meter reading success rate. So when you're out there meter reading, are you getting all of those meters? How are you maintaining your billing records, the type of customer meter records, the type of customer meter testing and replacement program, and the type of customer billing auditing procedures. So these are related to how we're doing auditing, how we're doing customer testing and replacements, that type of thing. So let's look at the water audit spreadsheet again.
All right, so where we left off was the score of 58. And if we go up to billed metered, which is the second group of inputs for your authorized consumption, we started a 1. If we go to a 2, our overall score changes to a 59. And then if we go to a 4, our grade changes to a 62. A 6, we see a change of a 64. We do the 8, except I always hit the wrong button. We see a score of 66. And then finally, if we get to the 10, we're up to the 68.
So this one, I think, went from what, a 58 to a 68. Is that what we're?
So it's 1 for 1 for this one.
All right. So how does this one rate? When we look at high, medium, or low, how does this particular one rate? So we have high as one option. Anybody else? This one is probably the second highest data grade. It may be tied, but it's right up there. So it probably would be either a high or, at least a medium change. But again, sort of giving away the punchline a little bit, this is probably the number 2 or tied for number 2 data point. So it is going to have a fairly big impact on the audit, and certainly compared to length of mains, it has a much bigger impact. So now let's look at, this particular data point and data grading and kind of what goes into the data grading. Working on that, does that help the overall system? So let's look at what goes into that. So how many of the customers are metered? So again, if we're not metering everybody, that would be an issue. The meter reading success rate, the customer billing records, type of customer meter records, meter testing and replacement program, and the customer billing auditing procedures. So if we're in a situation where we're not metering every customer, that can be very, very important to us, because this is our cash register. So when we're looking at our system as a whole, if we don't meter all of our customers, that's hugely impactful, because somebody is potentially using a lot of water and not having to pay for it. We want to look at meter reading success rate. So if we're not getting enough meters read. So if we have a low success rate, we're going to have to change our procedures to improve that, because again, we're talking about the cash register of our system. Let's look at our customer meter testing and replacement program. This is an area where there's a lot of room for efficiency. So are we actually testing the meters regularly to see how they're performing over time, so that we know when the meters are not reading well? And if a meter stops or it reads low, it's in our error, it's detrimental to us. It's usually in the favor of the customer. It's not 100% true, but generally speaking, the customer benefits and the utility doesn't. So we really want to be on top of this. And if we think of our commercial meters, our big commercial meters, they're really going to be our big cash registers. And if we're not doing a good customer testing program for those, you know, we can really be giving away a lot of water. One utility I worked with found out that one of their customer meters for their biggest commercial customer was off by a factor of 100, so that it was reading 100 times less than the amount of water they were using. So instead of, say, every time 100 gallons went through the meter, 1 gallon registered, because of the way that it was sending the signal. So the meter was sending a signal that was off by 2 decimal places, and that cost them a ton of revenue. So going and looking at that sort of thing really helped them bring in revenue. And how often you replace meters is a real cost issue. So if you're replacing them too often, you might be spending too much money. If you're not replacing them often enough, you might be losing out on revenue. So if we look at this particular data point, I would say it has at least a medium, if not a high impact on the overall operation of the utility. It has a reasonably high impact on both. So it's going to help you improve your data validity score, but it's also going to help you with the overall operation, maintenance, and finance management and financing of your utility. So I think it's really important for you to keep in mind that as you're going through the water audit, that there's a bigger picture behind the water audit. So yes, the audit is kind of giving you a snapshot in time of what's happening with your water. But as you're trying to improve procedures to get better data validity scores, better data grades, it's also going to have an impact on your utility. And it could be a different impact, you know, for your utility than it is for the water audit. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Dawn to talk about our applied activities for today.
All right. I'm sharing my screen here. So as we've done in the past, we want to give you a chance to practice what you've learned about today. So the applied activity for this session is to practice what you learned. So just like we talked about the 3 defaults that are in the audit, we want you to think about how, if you're using the defaults, why are you using them? And then why might you want to use internal data instead of the default data? So we gave you some of our answers. You gave us some answers for the bigger group, but we want you to think about it for your system specifically. And then we want you to think about if you should consider changing your procedures in your upcoming audits or not. And, you know, when would that make sense to make that change? Do you want to do all of them in the same year? Do you want to spread it out? So we just want you to kind of think about the defaults that are in the audit and if they're providing good information to you or not, and, you know, why you would want to maybe make the change. And then once you've taken a look.
And Dawn, as you're sharing that, you might want to turn off the paragraph symbol.
I forgot to do that. I apologize. Now I've got to figure out how to make my toolbar come back. There we go.
Yeah, I always tease Dawn because she's the only person I know that can handle the paragraph symbol being on all the time. I can't deal with it.
I think I just don't even see it anymore. I'm just kind of blind. I always have it turned on. So the second part of what we want you to do, I'll go back and show the graph without any paragraph marks, just so that you can see that it's a nice clean graph. And then the second part that we want you to do is to use the data validity worksheet tool. So that's the spreadsheet that James showed. where you answer a series of questions and the spreadsheet generates your data validity grade for that data point based on your answers. And the reason we want you to do this is because we realize that the requirement to have a score of 80 or higher influences your thought process when you're putting your data grades into your audit. But we really want you to look at that bigger picture and think about that bigger picture. And of course, this is just an activity for you to do internally. I'm not going to ask you to turn it in. I'm not going to ask you to tell me how different the results were. But what we really want you to do is to take a step back and use that worksheet and see where your data grades land versus the data grades that are maybe in your last audit, and think about why there may be differences and what that means to your system. And how are you using those data grades? Are you looking at just the audit and the score that the state's requiring, or are you looking at that bigger picture of water loss control? So this is just a chance for you to do some internal analysis of a process that's maybe gotten to be, you know, old hat, so to speak, where it's comfortable and you know that it fits and all those kinds of things. We want you to maybe try a new hat on. So the website is here that James showed you, where you can go and get that worksheet. So I am going to send this document out right now to everyone in the chat. And you can, as soon as it comes out, you can download it to your computer. And if you don't do that now, I will also send it in an email later this afternoon. So I am uploading that right now, and it should be shared. So if you click on it, you can download it right now in the chat box. And again, if you don't do it now, I will email it this afternoon. And then I'm going to switch screens again here. I just want to put up our contact information, a few last little things we want to talk about before we're out of time. So darn it, I did that backwards. I am just not having great luck right now, am I? All right, let's try this one more time. I'll share my screen. And then I will start the presentation. All right, so we just shared the applied activity, and then we wanted to remind you that we are here to help. We can provide that technical assistance as part of the training program at no cost. So again, let us know if there's anything we can help with. And it doesn't have to be specific to today's training or to any of the trainings that we've done thus far. It can be anything related to water loss. So if you've got questions about you know, how you might start collecting information on theft, or how you might move away from the default for your data inaccuracies. You know, we can work with you on evaluating your billing data and looking at ways to flag data that maybe looks a little odd, and figuring out if there's reasons why it looks odd, or if it was just a weird month, or so there are lots of things that we can do to help. So just a reminder that we are here. It will cost you nothing, and we can work with you to you know, answer questions that you have, or develop spreadsheets, or review your data, or just to answer, you know, general questions about water loss. And then finally, we want to give you a chance to ask us any questions about the session today. So feel free to use that chat box or to unmute, and we will do our best to give you some answers. And while we are letting you type in your questions, I am going to put up our contact information. So you have our email addresses there, and the office phone number, but right now no one's in the office. Probably best to use our emails at the moment, and to get in touch with us if you have any questions that come up between now and the next session. And CEUs are provided for operators. I will submit the attendance from today to the state for your CEUs for your for 3 hours today. if you are looking for credit for board certification or for professional engineering license, that type of thing, send me an email and I will send you an attendance certificate. So my email is there at the bottom of the screen if you need an attendance certificate. If you are looking for operator certificate or operator credits, you don't have to do anything except for having registered and attended today. I will take care of all of that. So if there are any questions, feel free to type them in now, and we will answer them. And Heather and James and I will stick around for a few minutes after the presentation so that if you prefer to just unmute and chat with us, we're happy to do that. Otherwise, feel free to leave the session as soon as we're done here. We want to thank you for being here today and for sticking with us for 3 hours. We know that's a long time to sit. We hope the breaks helped. This is the longest of our sessions. The remainder of our sessions will be 2-hour sessions. So we hope to see you at our future sessions. And thanks again for being here today, everybody. Have a great day.